Okay, watching remote baseball games live before television. Really. Now, look at this picture. This is people watching the 1911 World Series as seen in Times Square, and try to remember that because I'm going to show you something a little bit later about it. These are the first televised baseball games in the United States. At the right, the first Major League Baseball game was August 26th of 1939 between the Cincinnati Reds and the Brooklyn Dodgers at Ebbets Field, and on May 17th between Princeton and Columbia at Baker Field. Those weren't quite the earliest baseball games. There was one done in Japan in 1931 with a mechanical television system. I'm not sure if anyone was able to make out anyone on the field, but anyway, they tried it. And before that, in 1928, when Bell Labs was experimenting with what might be called sports, some people call this the first televised tennis game, but it's really just a Bell Labs engineer holding a tennis racket. One of the engineers thought they could move the camera machine, which is that thing on the right, to the polo grounds and actually shoot a baseball game. So if that's the earliest televised baseball, what's this guy talking about? This is Cleveland pitcher Bob Lemon, and he was inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame in 1976, and in his induction speech he said, "I was born in September, and my mother had to see the World Series at the old Opera House in Redlands, California. And in those days they didn't have babysitters, they had clothes baskets. So they put old Lem in a clothes basket, and they went to see the World Series. I was probably about 6 weeks old." Well, he was born in 1920. So what was his mother watching the World Series on? 1920 World Series was between Cleveland and Brooklyn. What were they watching? And how about this book, 8 Men Out, the book that's the basis for the movie? It's about the Black Sox scandal of the 1919 World Series. On the right you see the gambler Arnold Rothstein, and the book says that he went to where he was living in the Ansonia Hotel in New York to see the signal that the fix was in. Now the game was being played in Cincinnati, but he went to a hotel in New York, 600 miles away, to see that the fix was in. What was he watching? And according to the book, it was almost like being there, witnesses said. Well, let's go back even farther to some twin births in 1845. Baseball, more or less as we know it, with 3 strikes to an out, 3 outs to a half inning, 90 feet between the bases. Those rules were adopted in 1845, and also Samuel Morse started working on commercial telegraph service in 1845, which meant that when baseball started doing away games, it was possible to cover them by telegraph. Now, this says it's the first sports bar, but actually the picture isn't. The picture is from the 1876 Democratic National Convention in St. Louis at the Merchants Exchange Building. But a year earlier and a block away at Massey's Billiard Hall, they paid Western Union to deliver the sports scores inning by inning, which they posted on a blackboard. So it was sort of like a sports bar. You could look up from your billiard table and see what the score was. But that was about it. Until in 1884 in Nashville, 3 telegraph operators came up with a brilliant idea. One would go out to where the game was being played and would telegraph the plays back to the other 2. One of the other 2 would receive the plays on the telegraph and would announce what was happening, and the third one would move cards around on a large poster of the ball field so you could tell at a glance where everyone was and what was going on. This was so successful that even though they started in the 900-seat Masonic Theater, they soon had to move to the 2,500-seat Opera House. Now, a year later in Augusta, Georgia, at the Opera House, they were also doing baseball, and in Atlanta, too. There's a headline from the Atlanta Constitution in 1886, "Baseball at the Opera House, a complete and convenient arrangement to take the game in detail." And what they did was they painted a ball field on the stage and hired young boys in uniform to run around and recreate the plays as they were coming in. Meanwhile, the original 3 telegraph operators started spreading out and did demonstrations in Boston, Chicago, Cincinnati, and Detroit. And by the time we get to Detroit, there's a report in the Detroit Free Press in July 9th of 1886 that shows that this was the origin of the sportscast. They talk about how the announcer would say, "And it's a high fly, and it's going to Dalrymple, and will he get it? Yes, Dalrymple gets it!" And the audience erupts in applause. Everything moved outdoors in 1888. There was an editor at Joseph Pulitzer's New York World, and he decided it might be nice to put a baseball bulletin, as they were called at that time, in front of the building. And they did, and soon a crowd of 6,000 gathered and blocked all the traffic on the Brooklyn Bridge. And by the way, he took out a patent on his system because he was urged to do so by Pulitzer's secretary, who paid him for the patent. And then the secretary came up with another patent, and between those two patents, the secretary earned enough money to buy the Boston Post. There were improvements that were done. At the left here, you see the original 1888 system, and all it was holes on a board that pins could be stuck into, and the pins were different colors and had names or numbers on them so you could tell who the players were. In 1889, they improved that to being able to move the pins around. So if you look up by those numbers at the top, 2 and 5, you'll see little cranks sticking out. And the cranks could be operated at different speeds, so you can see that the pins are different positions away from base. One person is just leaving first base, and another one is halfway between second and third. By 1891, electricity started being applied, and by the way, the guy who came up with that system was also the first person to suggest that you could fly across the Atlantic in 6 hours. And then came androids, believe it or not, little men that would run around the bases. Notice there's a string on the catcher's mask so it could be pulled up if he was going to catch a fly, and there's another string attached to the batter's bat so he could drop it down. There would be descriptions saying that the batter connects with the ball and then drops the bat with a sickening thud as he runs to first base, and so on. And here's a description that appeared in the Times of Richmond on May 7th, 1895, about one of those systems, Sam Crowder's Little Men. One charming young girl was heard to say, "Aren't they just the dearest, cutest little fellows you ever saw? And so polite? Why, they bow as sweetly as real live men when they're applauded." And another, "I declare, I thought little Jake Wells looked positively handsome when he knocked that home run." And then here's a story from the New York Times. This is the entire article. It says that Tom Johnson, in proposing to provide Cleveland with municipal baseball bulletin boards, emphasizes the rule that the people must have the urgent necessities of life, even if some of the luxuries are omitted. Now on the left are some promotional materials for the Compton Electric Baseball Impersonator, and on the right is a 2012 Game Changer app for a smartphone. Quite a similarity between the two, don't you think? Now here's a story that appeared in the New York Evening Telegram in 1911 during the World Series. The headline says, "Thousands watch game on Telegram's Playograph, see every play as it occurs on Polo Ground." The story says that it was actually 70,000 people in Herald Square, and I believe it because there was a jeweler who was so upset that he lost business that he sued and got an injunction against them using the system. The stadium was only a few miles away, and the stadium had only 50,000 people in it. But remember that picture on the first slide that I told you to remember? That was the same World Series, but that was in Times Square, which was about a half a mile north, and they had maybe another 50,000 people. And the story in the Telegram also talks about how people were watching in armories, and people eventually watched in places like Madison Square Garden. So an awful lot more people were watching on these watching systems than had been in the stadium to begin with. Also, there were stories saying that there were kids up in the stadium, and they were saying, "Oh yeah, gee, it's great to be in the stadium here for the World Series, but what would you give to be in Times Square right now?" There was also a story in the Times about James Barrie, the guy who came up with Peter Pan, and how he asked to change rooms at the Knickerbocker Hotel on a trip to New York so he could watch the moving ball of light for hours outside his window. Now here are some of the improvements. The system that was in Herald Square that the telegram was talking about, that was an automatic baseball playograph. And if you look at the picture in the upper left, you'll see a little white dot in one of the outfields. That's an actual regulation size baseball, and it's connected to some thin wires, and someone in the back who was operating the playograph would move the ball to exactly where it had gone in the actual play. In the center is a Jackson mannequin system, another one of those robotic androids. At the bottom right is the Noakes Electroscore. That had 1,500 light bulbs, and they could be illuminated to show the arc of where the ball went. And then at the lower left and the upper right, the lower left is a front view at Washington's National Theater, and the upper right is a rear view, is the Coleman electric scoreboard, and it used 400 slide projectors and a crew of 5 to make it work. Between 1889 and 1927, there were 44 U.S. patents that were issued for these viewing systems, and some of the most important weren't patented, like the Electroscore or the Rodier system. They weren't patented at all. And it wasn't just big cities. On the left here, you see an ad from the Arizona Daily Star, which is the newspaper in Tucson, and it talks about how they're sponsoring World Series viewing at the Opera House in Tucson in 1931. At the top is Laramie, Wyoming, with people watching in 1925. At the bottom right, Muncie, Indiana in 1923. And on the left, Waynesburg, Pennsylvania in 1925. Now, Waynesburg was such a small community that they couldn't afford the Western Union lines, and they couldn't afford to buy any of these fancy systems. So 2 local electricians built their own system, and they used shortwave radio to figure out what was going on. So this was a thriving business well into the 20s and even the 30s. But then disaster was going to strike. Before that, here's a picture of Walter Reed Army Hospital in 1918. So, what happened? Harold Arlen, in 1921, announced the first baseball game over a radio broadcast. And it was actually quite terrible, because all he did was announce the plays. He would say, oh yes, he just got a hit and he got to first base. And then there would be nothing, just dead silence, because he was waiting for the next play to happen, and baseball is a slow game. But eventually, radio took off. It started with simulations, which actually followed the same kind of thing as what these telegraph systems were doing. People would sit in the studio, get telegraph information, hit 2 pieces of wood together for the sound of the bat hitting the ball, make crowd noises, and so on. Ronald Reagan was one of the people who did those radio recreations of baseball games. And by the way, a technique that they eventually came up with was if the telegraph line went down, there were lots of foul balls. Oh, he just fouled again. Oh, there's another foul ball. Oh, there's another foul ball. And this would go on until the line came back up, and then they could report what was actually happening. But by the 1930s, radio got stronger and stronger, and so the big picture that you see here on the right is in Montrose, Colorado in 1939, and there's a handful of people, maybe those who would have been passing by anyway, just taking a glance at a bulletin board that's keeping score outside the local newspaper. But that's 1939, and 1939 is when television started. So it was the end of one era and the beginning of another.